we're going to have Kelly O'Brien. And Kelly O'Brien is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Regional Development. And she's going to talk to you a lot about what that is and how that gets started. But before she came to be one of the founders or the founder of the Alliance for Regional Development, she served as the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration as Director of Public Affairs for the Liaison for the Secretary. She was an associate at a New York investment banking firm where she specialized in affordable housing and a healthcare facility municipal bond finance, all things that we need within the Chicagoland area. She also served on George H.W. Bush's administration and communication and congressional affairs capacities and began her career in the Office of Communications for the First Lady Barbara Bush in the White House. She also became the Special Assistant Director of Congressional Affairs. She received a degree in political communications from the George Washington University, as well as her JD from Loyola University, Chicago School of Law. So, Kelly, come on up, and I'm going to ask, can you push buttons?
Yes.
All right, so just down arrow, up arrow.
I can push buttons.
Oh, my goodness. All right, thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Good morning. It was nice to get some fresh air now, wasn't it? And it's really nice to be back in the air conditioning. So I want to thank Michael Edgar and Carolyn Kahn and Shai Lothan for putting this event together and for the hard work that they do year after year. You know, I know they're building on something that is very, very critical, and especially the comment that was just made about how the bigger companies, they can hire the consulting firms and they have the resources, but it's that middle market and small market that often are neglected. And there is so much opportunity there, and that's why a meeting like this and the work that this group does is so important, and why I'm so proud as the president of the Alliance for Regional Development to team up with Select Chicago, and I really am looking forward to doing some really great work in the year ahead. For those of you that are not familiar, okay, now I promised I could hit a button. How many here by show of hands are familiar with the OECD? Oh, good, excellent. I can't tell you how many audiences I go to where I just get this like blank look on their faces. And it's understandable, a lot of Americans are not familiar with the OECD, but as many of you know, and those that are not familiar, the OECD was created after World War II to implement the Marshall Plan, and they currently house more economic data than any institution on the planet. They advise the G7, the G20, and they do what they call these territorial reviews all over the world, but they had never done one in the United States. Now, in all honesty, I cannot tell you, I have not tracked what or if the Trump administration, I know that they are funding the OECD, I don't know the numbers. Previous to the Trump administration, I know that the US State Department would give the OECD about $100 million annually. And as Michael mentioned, I did have, part of my career was working at the US Department of Commerce, and while I was there, I was fortunate to work very closely with the OECD. So when there was discussion about getting a territorial review, obviously it was very exciting when this region was selected. But it wasn't just the region, it was a lot of conversation that took place once the grant was awarded to actually do this study. The first question was, well, what are the subject area? Is it going to be the city of Chicago? Is it going to be the state of Illinois? What is it going to be? So after looking at a lot of data and after a lot of conversation, it was really interesting because there was a picture of a satellite picture of the night sky, and as you can see, kind of right up there, there's this uninterrupted band of lights. And believe it or not, at this conference table, as people were just kind of going through things, and they looked at that, they kind of said, that's it. I mean, everything points to the fact that the Milwaukee, Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana, that we operate as an economic unit, it is kind of that unit there, but because of the 3 state lines, we don't always coordinate our policies. In fact, we rarely coordinate our policies. And because of that, all 3 states are really missing out. And so what we did with this report, when it was published back in the spring of 2012, it's a 300-page kind of a roadmap for how to grow the regional economy. And I will tell you, as somebody who was literally there from day one, who got the phone call, sitting in my chair at the U.S. Department of Commerce, saying, how would we go about getting a grant to get the OECD, to do a study here in the Chicagoland area? From that point, to today, where my whole life is about, regional collaboration, I will share with you that one of a very defining moment early on, and this was shortly after the grant was awarded, and I was charged with calling some of the leaders in the 3 states to let them know that the grant was awarded. We were not calling for a single penny. I thought that these calls would be received, with open arms. What an exciting opportunity. Well, how many of you remember a couple summers ago that Scaramucci rant that was really made popular with the swearing and the cussing and all that? I mean, I literally had one of the secretaries of Commerce screaming and swearing at me, telling me that this was the stupidest idea he ever heard, and he didn't want to work with the state next door, and what in the matter with me even calling him to talk about this? I mean, it was crazy. So that's where I said, oh my goodness, but the grant was awarded, and we were going to go forward. And so the group that led this worked really hard at making sure that the stakeholders that did get involved, some by choice, others, we had to kind of pull along, but we got them there, that everybody understood that for this project, it was an equal playing field. And there was a lot of consternation, is Chicago going to eat us for lunch? Why would we tell them what we're doing here with this water cluster, blah, blah. And so, it was a process. But in the process, relationships were formed across the state lines. And when the report was published, a lot of the stakeholders said, we really need a neutral platform to bring together sorry, I'm going back to that mouse again. We really need a neutral platform to convene decision makers, to explore opportunities for collaboration. And we created the Alliance for Regional Development, and many people did not think that we would even see a 1-year anniversary, never mind the fact that we've hit 7 years. So I'm really proud of that. And as the slide shows, this is the 21 county region. That's really our footprint. But the message of the OECD report was don't get caught up with arbitrary boundaries. So although for purposes of the report, it's the Milwaukee, Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana corridor, and these 21 counties, which is a little bit larger than the traditional MSA. But these 21 counties, we are actually the 3rd largest contributor to the national GDP. And back when the report was published in the spring of 2012, we were just coming out of the Great Recession. And the data that they looked at for the 10 years prior, they were able to determine that during the 10 years before the Great Recession, those were good years. We're living in good years. If we had just grown then at the national average, we would have had over 600,000 more jobs to have cushioned the Great Recession. And guess what, guys? We're still not growing at the national average. That being said, as I mentioned, there was a lot of skepticism whether or not a regional economic development group could really last. And one of the things, again, that I'm proud of is the fact that we now have, 7 years under our belt. And many days it does feel like we're pushing a boulder up a hill, with a pinky finger. But what's happening is the rest of the world is catching on to this. So this is an example of some of the other regional economic development groups that have sprouted up around the country. Now, the Regional Plan Association, they are really the first out of the box, and that's New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. But the others, I've received phone calls, when they said, we're going to create this. How did you do it? What advice do you have? So, for example, at the bottom corner, Borderplex. This is a group that's actually headquartered in El Paso. I was just on the phone with them over the weekend, making sure that they were okay. And they have an interesting challenge from the standpoint that when they are created in their footprint is part of New Mexico, part of Texas, and a state in the country of Mexico. So they often say to me, oh, you think you've got it rough? Try 2 countries and 3 states, and especially, with everything that's happening now. The logo right above it, Reedy Cincinnati, that is Ohio, Indiana, and a piece of Kentucky. I mean, they're just going gangbusters. So it's an example that this can happen. And I'm really sharing this in large measure for the municipalities that are in the audience today, because it's really critical that we work together and that we begin to say, as so many of you that are here today, there's benefit to working together. Regional collaboration has an important role. Now, in terms of what the Alliance does, part of this is we do have an economist on our team, and I just wanted to show you an example of some of the data that we collect. So you may be familiar with the fact that on the first Friday of the month, we get a jobs report. Everybody in the country hears how many jobs have grown in that last month. And so what we do then, the economist on our team, is he takes that and he breaks it down. Okay, there was 140,000 jobs in the US. What does that mean to the mega region? Another example of the data collection is that we look really at inflation, and we try to see, how are we doing both in the subparts of the mega region, as well as how does the mega region compare nationally. I think one of the real interesting points that we have witnessed is that there's kind of an uptick in some of the inflation in the Milwaukee Racine area, and there is some speculation that that may be because of Foxconn, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I was really intrigued by the Sitka speaker that just talked about supply chain, because we are all about supply chain. And last year, we had a summit at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. It was our 6th. And we're very fortunate that we team up with the Federal Reserve Bank and we host a summit on regional competitiveness. Last year, we had the #2 executive from Asia for Foxconn fly in and was one of our keynote speakers. Since then, he has kept in regular contact with the chairman of my board at the Alliance. And one of the conversations that is being had is, Wisconsin provided a very attractive incentive package for Foxconn to locate in Wisconsin. And we want Wisconsin to, reap as the benefits for the investment that they're making. But where there are gaps, where Wisconsin companies don't exist or don't have the resources, what we want is to make sure that Foxconn is looking at the mega region, the Chicagoland area and Northwest Indiana, before looking at other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And it's not exclusive just to Foxconn. I'm just using that as an example. We really need to do a better job of making those supply chain links within the mega region and supporting businesses from that standpoint. We also had a speaker at last year's summit that we flew in from South Carolina, because we were looking around the country and we said, where else has a company located that was really transformational, the way that there's expectations that Foxconn will do? And we noticed that BMW in Spartanburg was a great best practice. And what South Carolina did when BMW announced that they were going to move there in the 90s is that they did 2 things really well. Number one, they came up with a great supply chain strategy. And that's something, again, that the Alliance is at the forefront of working on with Foxconn and is interested in expanding that. The second thing that they did was cluster development. And because of the cluster analysis and execution, South Carolina is now the #1 exporters of tires in the United States. So doesn't it just make sense that we get an understanding of what business opportunities can be grown out of, whether it's Foxconn or it's the existing clusters that we have? One of our strengths is that this mega region is so diverse. Remember, we used to be the Rust Belt. We're not the Rust Belt anymore. We've got a very diverse economy, and that's just kind of happening organically, and that's great. But let me tell you, there are best practices that we can follow that will make a difference for everyone in this room. And times are a-changin'. And I found this particularly interesting. You know, we are going into this personalization X.0. We're living in what, you know, we call the Industrial Revolution 4.0. And it's just a reminder that we cannot just sit on our laurels. Things are changing and we have to keep up. And I'll go back to the OECD report for a second, because back when this was published in 2012, this particular point caught a lot of people off guard, and it was in the workforce section. And in the workforce section of the report, they talked about the fact that our workforce boards were training people to make the biggest, fast, best widget. But then they would go get a job in a manufacturing company, and the manufacturing company were making widgets from the 1970s, and there was that disconnect. So we need to make a better effort at making sure that our local companies are adopting the technologies and keeping current so that we are at the forefront nationally and internationally. We can make that happen here in this mega region, and we are making it happen. So for those of you from overseas, we want you to feel comfortable that this is the place where you should tell businesses that they want to be. And if you don't believe me, just think about the fact of how the market adoption for the telephone took so long, and for a cell phone, is there anyone in the room that doesn't have a cell phone? And that's just one example of, again, what we're talking about is the idea that the 21st century will be equivalent to 20,000 years of progress at today's rate. And the other interesting thing is that a lot of projections are that 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies will not exist in a meaningful way in a mere 10 or 11 years. I mean, these are companies that we're all very familiar with, but there is a lot of change that is going to happen, that is happening, and we are working at positioning this region to be very successful. The last little tidbit that I wanted to share, and kind of going from the micro level to a micro level, is in addition to the work that we do for the Alliance, kind of on the other side of the house, we work very specifically with the city of Chicago. You know, that is the driver of the regional economy. And as many of you know, there's struggles in the city's neighborhoods. And so we have members that are part of the leading architectural firms, design firms, there's real estate lawyers, there's the biggest developers in the city, and we are organizing 5 teams. There are 5 neighborhoods that are 4 on the south side, 1 on the west side. We have neighborhood points of contact that are the clients for this pro bono project. And these teams of experts are going to go into these neighborhoods and look at 2-block corridors and literally look structure by structure and problem solve and vision what needs to be done to revitalize these neighborhoods. And this will help make Chicago stronger, and as Chicago is stronger, the region is stronger. So we're working on many fronts, and so when it comes to what can you do, I strongly encourage you to stay involved with Select Chicago. If you're not involved with the Alliance for Regional Development, please get involved. Let's make a difference. Let's position this region to adapt to the changes that are coming, to be able to facilitate the needs of the international community and the current business community. And let's make sure that we are able to sustain whatever economic ebbs and flows there are. So with that, I just want to give you an idea of some of the Alliance sponsors, and to again thank Michael for this opportunity, and to let you know again that we really do invite you to get involved. Thank you. Do you have time for any questions? You guys are gonna let me off easy? I see one back there. Sure. So each group does something a little bit different, and one of the differences is, you know, again, depending on the group, they have different support from maybe their public sector, their private sector. we're in a situation now where we have two new governors. We have, Wisconsin has a new governor, Illinois has a new governor. We have a new mayor in the city of Chicago. So we're in the process of, really taking their temperature and figuring out who understands regional economic development, who's going to embrace this platform. And I'm happy to report that at this point, all signs are very positive, and that there is a meeting in September where everybody has committed to send high-level staff to discuss how the alliance will move forward. You're right about the fact that in those, some of those groups actually have the governors who have agreed that we will work together and support this group, and that they collectively work on some of the more traditional business location and relocation, really understanding that they all win as long as they come to that area versus somewhere else. Here, we're still very much caught up in that mentality where we're fighting, if they come to Wisconsin, it's looked at as a loss to Illinois. We're trying to change that mentality, and I'm hoping with these new administrations that we'll be able to make, some more progress. I'll say candidly, we had 3 Republican governors, this time last year. And when we first got 3 Republican governors elected, I thought, well, 3 from the same party, this is really going to help us take off. And there were still a lot of challenges. So it doesn't really matter. Economic development is not Republican or Democrat. It's really about the mentality, and that's why everyone in this room is so important, because if they're hearing from the municipalities, if they're hearing from the counties, if they're hearing from businesses that have regional footprints, then they will be more inclined to work together, and that means a win-win for all of us. Thank you so much.